To the Middle East now, where Israel is pushing ahead with a large-scale military operation in the occupied West Bank. It is focused on the area of Jenin. Palestinian health officials say at least 10 people have been killed. Hundreds of families have also left their homes after being advised to by Israeli forces. Israel's Defence Minister Israel Katz says the military is applying lessons learned in Gaza in the operation. The army says it is aiming to counter militant groups that are backed by Iran. Let's bring in Dahlia Scheindlin. She's a political analyst, columnist at the Haaretz newspaper and fellow at the Century International think tank based in Tel Aviv. Welcome to DW. Now, why has Israel launched this major operation in the West Bank now?
Well, we were all speculating about that, but let's just say it's very consistent with Israeli policy throughout the course of this war. There was a previous very serious incursion into Tulkarm earlier in 2024 over the summer, and it's partly because of the destabilization of the West Bank due to the war in large part, and also very long-term breakdown of the authority, both of the Palestinian Authority and fragmentation of militarized factions. There's been rising violence between Palestinians and settlers and a rise in settler violence against Palestinians already a couple of years before the war. And then, of course, this government has long since announced that it wants to annex the West Bank. This has been an open aim of this government since its establishment. At this particular moment, we can speculate. What the prime minister has said is that that this is part of the Iran axis of evil. And, well, he didn't use the term axis of evil, but that's what every Israeli hears. And that this threat needs to be stamped out wherever it is, including in the West Bank. There's another theory that the coalition members are emboldened by the fact that nobody's really paying attention to the West Bank in light of the pressure and intensive action around getting to a ceasefire and the agreement in Gaza. And there's another, analysis that says, well, if Israel is releasing Palestinian prisoners who have been convicted of security and terror offenses to the West Bank, then there has to be a major show of force, specifically to deter and prevent them from undertaking terror activity. But I think the bigger picture is more important, and that's that the Israeli army has been establishing these kinds of incursions in very significant ways throughout the West Bank, and particularly into major Palestinian centers where we see a lot of militant activity as part of Israel's general continued and expanding control over the West Bank.
Now, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres spoke earlier at Davos, and he said that it was unclear what the future relationship between Israel and the Palestinians could look like. He said one possibility was a two-state solution, but he also outlined another potential outcome. Let's take a quick listen.
The other possibility is for Israel, feeling emboldened by the military successes that it has had, to think that this is the moment to do the annexation of the West Bank and to keep the Gaza in a kind of a limbo situation with an unclear form of governance. It is clear for me that Israel is not fundamentally interested in Gaza, it's fundamentally interested in the West Bank.
Now, what do you make of that statement from Antonio Guterres?
I think it's mostly an accurate reading. Again, I think that the main interest of this government is that there will never be a Palestinian independent state. They are trying to dismantle the Palestinian national aspirations in any level. And to that extent, Gaza is important as part of dismantling that project. And of course, we have ministers who very much want to annex Gaza as well and reestablish settlements there. So I don't think it's entirely the case that Gaza is not that important from the Israeli government's perspective. And the question of whether Israel is now beginning the annexation of the West Bank also needs to be seen in a bigger context in which not only has the government been aiming to annex the West Bank, but it has been undertaking moves that are effectively de facto annexation of the West Bank, again, during the course of this government, which has been in power for almost 2 years, and of course, long before that, certainly by expanding settlements, but also through bureaucratic means, through declaring certain swaths of land to be state land, which means only Israel can use it for development, and for increasing, infrastructure, expansion, keeping control of water sources, all sorts of means that are a lot less visible. Israel has been putting those into effect We have the International Court of Justice having ruled that Israel's holdover parts of the West Bank constitute essentially an illegal annexation. And so these things are already happening. I think that the military action right now is important, but I wouldn't be so sure that this is the final word in terms of declaring annexation, simply because it might be a limited operation that ends, and nobody should take their sight off of all the other ongoing forms of de facto annexation that have been happening before and will continue after this military operation.
Now, how much public support do you think there is in Israel for the formal annexation of large parts of the West Bank, even though it violates international law, as you said?
Well, it gets a little complicated. Every time we looked at this question during 2020, when the government was openly promising to begin the formal annexation of the West Bank, what we found is that there was not actually a majority for it in surveys. It was just under 50% throughout that year, which is surprising because usually when something becomes very legitimized by the government and moves ahead in a very clear direction of policy, you would tend to see rising support for it. And, so that was already a division back in 2020 within the Israeli public. What we're seeing now is that there are certainly more people among Israeli Jews who support the annexation of the West Bank and giving Palestinians only limited rights there than there are Israeli Jews who support a two-state solution based on two equal, separate sovereign states. And so in the past, there was just a small lead among the Jewish population for those who supported annexation. And now, after the war, and the survey that I've conducted together with my Palestinian colleagues in July 2024, we have about twice as many Israeli Jews who support annexation and limited rights for Palestinians over the two-state solution, and yet it is still below the halfway mark. In other words, 42% of Israeli Jews, of course, Arab citizens don't support that at all. And as a result, it's interesting to note that the formal support for formal annexation of the West Bank still has not reached a majority of the Israeli citizens. So there is, a deep division around this issue, and yet the government is not concerned with the majority of the Israeli public. The government is concerned with very far right-wing, ultra-nationalist, religious fundamentalist portions of Israeli society.
Now, what will the annexation of the West Bank means for the Palestinians who live there? Briefly, if you can.
Well, their situation is bad and it will get worse. In other words, right now, the Palestinians are living under the effective control of Israel, a form of de facto annexation already. They have no representation in the Israeli government, and yet the Israeli government and the state of Israel, way beyond just the army, controls pretty much every aspect of their lives and controls all their resources and their freedom of movement, etc. And that's true in the West Bank, and it was true in Gaza as well, and it still is, of course. So, all I can say is that if there is formal annexation, if there's a declaration of annexation, it means they will not have any recourse to self-determination. They will not have any pathway towards Palestinian statehood, and they will have limited rights, and essentially they'll be living under a two-tiered legal system in a formalized manner. Their material situation might be exactly the same, but it will become permanent.
Dahlia Scheindlin, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.